Thank you all so much for coming. And we're just so thrilled to have so many people here, current students, parents, alumni, and pre-freshmen alike. The first thing I just want to start off with is how deeply saddened we all are in the kind of context that this comes in, and that if anyone here has friends that they just met a few hours ago or family back in Boston, just know that our thoughts and prayers are with you, and thank you still for coming and all of that. We are thrilled to be having this debate. I should mention early on that we were not able to have this debate without the generosity of Robert Rosenkranz, Nicholas Quinn Rosenkranz, and the Rosenkranz Foundation, who have generously sponsored a series of debates for the Buckley program. Before we get started, I do want to speak a few seconds about what the Buckley program is on campus. Along with our debate series, we have a speaker series in general, and where we've had a number of various speakers, from writers like Bret Stephens or George Will to academics such as Amity Shlaes, Harvey Mansfield, even Henry Kissinger, which is, I guess now it's his academic phase. Politicians from Mike Huckabee to Mitch Daniels to John Huntsman, and many more on the horizon. Along with our speaker series, we have a number of other functions on campus. We sponsor a series of internships for Yale students, as well as personal workshops with political activists and thinkers and writers, along with community service endeavors and social functions as well. For pre-freshmen, we're kind of thinking about things to get involved in. Yeah, we have a vibrant fellows program, which are a number of students who kind of give some time to help in the behind-the-scenes functioning of the Buckley program. And there's a great social component to that as well, from dinners to happy hours and anything in between. So there's the fun side of conservatism at Yale, which I promise exists, to assure all parents and students here. And on that topic, tonight's debate is particularly pertinent on the future of conservatism. It's not only incredibly difficult to be, or not difficult, challenging, invigorating and challenging to be an intellectual minority on a campus like Yale. It's even rougher when your party is losing, and losing rather unceremoniously. So I think we're all kind of looking and figuring out what to do next or what to figure out next. And this is something we're very excited to be talking about tonight. We're particularly happy to have Professor Stephen Smith be the moderator of tonight's debate, who I will introduce our guests. Professor Smith got his PhD from University of Chicago and has fortunately been with us since 1984. His career in political philosophy doesn't need much introduction. He's been Yale's most preeminent scholar in this field, notably with his course Introduction to Political Philosophy, which is now online. So even if you missed the boat while here, it is something that everyone should take the chance to look up for themselves. But his work is also included in depth in Hegel, Strauss, Spinoza, and everything in between, from the ancients to the moderns. Also a notable Yankees fan, but no one's perfect. And even with that aside, we're still thrilled to have him as our moderator. So Professor Smith, we'll kick it off.
Thank you very much, Harry. And I should say, for the purpose of the audience, some of those kind words he said were actually true, but only some. But in any case, it is an honor for me to moderate this debate tonight on the future of conservatism, which I notice was advertised without a question mark at the end, because the question might be, what is the future of conservatism, or is there a future for conservatism? And I also want to thank and echo what Harry said about the William F. Buckley program for organizing this debate. And I would say also for generally enlivening so much the quality of political and intellectual debate on our campus here. It is only a shame that we can't simply say today's debate is carried out in the shadow of Yale's glorious victory in the NCAA hockey tournament on Saturday, which I will say anyway, and also have to recognize that it is being carried on today under the shadow of what seems to be another terrorist attack on our homeland this afternoon up in Boston. I hope all I'll really do is introduce our two speakers and then leave it to them, but we'll see. David Brooks is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, and as many, if not all of you know, he is teaching a course here at Yale this semester. After college, at the University of Chicago, by the way, he worked for William F. Buckley at the National Review, and how he got his job there was the subject of an iconic column that he wrote called Remembering the Mentor on the occasion of Mr. Buckley's death. Mr. Brooks is the author of several books, including Bobos in Paradise, and more recently a book entitled The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement. One thing that he shares with his fellow op-ed columnist on the other side of the newspaper, Mr. Krugman, is that they both believe, interestingly, in the findings of modern social science. And they both believe that social science has something to contribute to our current debates. And being in a political science department, I'm glad to hear that, although what they believe social science contributes seems to be very different. Jay Nordlinger, our second speaker, is a senior editor at the National Review. He does a regular column called Impromptus on the National Review Online. You can find a collection of his writings on a wide range of subjects, as the title of his book indicates, called Here, There, and Everywhere. It was published by National Review Press. And among his other strings to his bow, he is a frequent classical music critic for magazines like the New Criterion and City Arts. And he has received the Eric Brandel Award for Excellence in Opinion Journalism, a very distinguished career. I should say at the outset, I'm not sure I'm the ideal person to serve as the moderator in this debate. I don't identify particularly as a conservative. But I should say I am happy to say that I have had both speakers on different occasions in my house at Branford College for master's teas when I was the master of that college. And it's a pleasure for me, and I want to thank the William F. Buckley Society program for asking me to moderate what I think is going to be a really interesting debate on the future of conservatism.
Thank you. They couldn't find an actual conservative faculty member. They found one who was willing to eat with them, though, so that's good enough. I taught here about 12 years ago, and it was before the Iraq War, and they had a whole series of panels, and they'd wheel out 9 liberals and Donald Kagan. And then the next night, 9 other liberals, Donald Kagan. It was Donald Kagan, Donald Kagan. So I, as was mentioned, I want to salute the Buckley Society because Buckley was my mentor. I was a student at the University of Chicago writing parodies. I was a humor columnist for the school paper, and Buckley was coming to campus, and he'd just written a book called Overdrive, which was an extremely pretentious book. And I wrote a parody of him as a name-dropping blowhard. And I said he wrote the first 3 volumes of his memoirs on the day of his birth, the first of all of human history up to his conception, and then Seeds of Utopia about the 9 months of his gestation, The Glorious Dawn about the day of his birth. Then he wrote 3 books, God and Me at Home, God and Me at Yale, God and Me Go to the Movies. In the afternoons, he spends his time going into rooms and making everybody else feel inferior. While at Yale, founded 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley and one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And so I wrote this up. He comes to campus, he gives a speech, and he says, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. And so that was the big break I had in my life. Sadly, I wasn't actually in the audience. But 3 years later, I call him up, and I say, is the offer still open? And he says, yeah. And so I translate from being a city reporter, a police reporter on the south side of Chicago covering murders and rapes, to his Park Avenue apartment where you go to dinner and they're putting finger bowls in front of you, which to me are like watery soup. Why are we eating water? But a very different style. And Buckley's talent was not only his rhetorical talent, his greatest talent was friendship. Somebody calculated that he wrote more letters in his lifetime than any other 20th century American, which is believable. And even as a 22, 23-year-old, he took me to Bach concerts, he took me yachting, he took me to plays, constantly having me over, asking my opinion about things, just the perfect sort of mentor that you want. sent me off on my life. I went to the Washington Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and I liken being the conservative columnist at the New York Times like being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not always a lot of company. But in the middle there, I worked for 9 years. The happiest 9 years of my career was at the Weekly Standard, where one of my colleagues was Jay Nordlinger, and we had, I hope, a good time together. He's not committing.
Very much, I second that.
So, okay. Jay has a musical background, as was mentioned. He worked, and I'm pretty sure I've got my facts right, he worked at a place called Def Jam Records. Early in his career, he was a member of something called the Wu-Tang Clan. He can tell you all about that. So I'm going to tell a little personal story as a way to get into conservatism in the Republican Party. And I'm going to take the position that the Republican Party in particular needs to maximally change, by going back to a original conception of conservatism that it had left for another version of conservatism. Now, it should be confessed, I did not start out as a conservative. My parents were radical. It was Greenwich Village in the 1960s. When I was 5, they took me to a be-in where hippies would go just to be. The hippies set a garbage can on fire, threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. I saw a $5 bill on fire. I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire and grabbed the money. And that was my first step over to the right. But it took a little while to take. And the seeds were actually planted by another experience for my family, which was my grandfather. My grandfather was an immigrant. He grew up with the family butcher shop on the Lower East Side. And there was a great sense, if you were an immigrant, that you wanted to make it in the city and you wanted to make it in this strange place called America because you were somewhat of an outsider. My great uncle was a guy named Irving Browning who collected powder horns and six-shooters and all this Western memorabilia because he was in love with America. He never in his life went west of the Hudson River because he was a New York Jew. But he was in love with America. And actually, I recently heard a song, a Borscht Belt song called Big Bad Irving, the 151st fastest gun in the West, which reminded me of him. But there was an ethos that you were trying to make it in this country, and to us it was making it in the city. We lived in the city, but we didn't really live in the city. The city was uptown, midtown, and uptown, where the WASPs lived, where people, you know, they had croquet, we had screaming. They were so tall and slender, they didn't have thighs, they just had one calf on top of the other. They were a different breed. And it is the triumph of America that when people think of WASP culture right now, they think of the clothing, the schmatas made by Ralph Lifshitz, now known as Ralph Lauren. But that essence of making it was the founding dream of the Republican Party. It goes back, I think, to Hamilton, poor boy who made good. It was carried on by the Whig Party, and then a young Whig who grew up in Illinois, who reading Shakespeare and the Bible, who was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a guy who desperately wanted to get off the farm, believed in work, believed the purpose of his life, as he told a group of immigrants, was to transform your station. Became a corporate lawyer, went to the state legislature, gave more speeches in his life about banking than about slavery, lobbied for a state bank to invest in industrial projects, lobbied for canals and railroads, got into the White House, did the same thing, lobbied for railroad legislation, the Homestead Act, the Land-Grant College Act, a single currency, the first income tax, using government in limited but energetic ways so poor boys and girls like him could succeed, to enhance social mobility. And that is one great strain that goes through the Republican Party from its founding.